Hey everyone, Greg Cazillo from Cazillo.com here with another Creating Photographs video. This particular photo, I really wanted to talk about two things. First is the exposure and aperture choice, as well as the program mode. Explain a little bit about how I came to that conclusion and how I was shooting at that moment. And the second thing is posing and body positions. Both of those are important. We definitely need to pay attention to all of those things when we are creating our photographs. So let's get right into it, and that's in the posing. That comes before anything. We've got to make sure that our subjects, our models, are in the right pose, in the right position. So first thing you're going to notice that the bride and groom are in a typical arm in arm pose. You don't see the groom's hand around the bride's waist, anything like that. You want to make sure that's hidden behind her, in her back, somewhere small of her back. There's no kind of fingers hanging around there, around that opposite side where he is. Sometimes you will have the hand up underneath the flowers for him to help hold the flower, especially if it's a big bouquet. That can always help. So next thing is everyone else's position. You'll notice how everyone is turned slightly in, or I should say slightly away, mimicking the position of the bride and groom. Has a nice flow, a nice even pattern. There's a slight curve to where they're standing. In other words, the people at the ends are a little bit closer to the camera. Not much though. Not much at all. Not enough that you're really even going to notice, especially since they're younger children and shorter adults. So that's helps a little bit. Next thing, guys' hands. Guys do this all the time, and I don't know why, but we have this habit to take and clench our fists when we're having our picture taken. I don't know what it is. So you always want to make sure that their hands are relaxed, and I actually had talked about that in an earlier video. Now the next thing are the women's flowers. You don't want the flowers, women don't want their flowers way up here. You want them down with a nice slight curve to the elbow, not a whole lot of position there, just a slight bend of the elbow, and that's enough. And then it's usually somewhere around the stomach area where the flowers end up falling. That's the perfect spot. Last thing I want to talk about is not too close. I did leave a little bit of space on the outside so that I can print this in 8x10 format if I needed to. And the other thing, I have a lot of space up and top and bottom so that I can, the main reason for this photo was in the album. So I can layer more photos on top or on the bottom, whether in the sky or whether it's in the bottom of the photo there. Either way, so those are all things you want to think about when creating photographs. Next, let's talk about exposure and aperture and what was going on when I created this photo. First, I was at 1/5000th of a second, f2.8, ISO 200. Now you're going to say, whoa, why were you at f2.8? That's a lot of light to be letting in. Well, let me set the scene a little bit. Number one, I was switching lenses. And when I'm switching lenses, especially between my 24 to 70 and 70 to 200, I like to have that nice shallow depth of field. And so when I'm switching in between, I typically don't like to be adjusting my settings too much if I don't have to. I like to be concentrating on what's going on, what I'm doing, what I'm shooting, the people, the scenery, everything. Make sure everything is going the way I want it to be, or make sure I'm not missing anything. So since I'm switching back and forth and creating two different kinds of images, first a little bit tighter headshot that has a nice blurry background, and then the next photo, which is this kind of a scene, I don't want to be changing those settings. So what I found out was that I started out in manual mode, and I was constantly changing my exposure, and finally I said, forget this, and I went to aperture priority mode, because when I would zoom in with a longer lens, I would end up underexposing a little bit, especially if they were on the shadow side of their face, if they turned to one side and the shadow, so it would be underexposing their face a little bit. Obviously, I don't want that to happen, so that's why I went to the aperture priority mode. And then I actually added a little bit of exposure, which was a third stop of the exposure bias or exposure compensation, and I do have a video on that which you can click over to if you'd like. Next thing, matrix metering. Got to be in matrix for this type of a photo. I wanted to basically look at everything in the scene. Wouldn't want to use spot because it's probably going to end up over or underexposing. And center weighted, it might have worked in this particular instance, but I just prefer the matrix, or I think Canon calls it evaluative, and so it worked out well. Last thing, aperture. There's we're talking 2.8 here, and we have a tiny little bit of depth of field, as you would think. But there's actually 4 things that go into giving you your depth of field. First is your lens. Second is your aperture. Third is the focus distance, how far your subject is away from the camera or from the lens. And lastly is your zoom position of that lens. Since I was shooting at 24mm at f2.8 and they were standing about 15 or 20 feet from me, it didn't matter. I knew that almost everything was going to be in focus. And that kind of comes to my point, which comes back to last week's point a lot, which was practice and knowing your equipment and how it's going to react and how it's going to work. If that's one of those things that I just didn't have to think about, I just knew that shooting at 2.8 at that distance at 24mm, I didn't have to worry about anything not being in focus. Making sure that I didn't have to go to f4 or f5.6 to make sure that each one of those people in that group are nice and sharp, even though my focus point was actually on the bride and groom. Didn't matter. Didn't matter, since I had all of that room, and so I knew my equipment and how it was going to react to that particular scene. So, as I always say, keep practicing your photography, keep working toward your outliers 10,000 hours. And so enjoy this photo. Any questions, comments, or concerns, I'd love to hear them. And any photography questions in general, please comment. Greg Cazillo, Cazillo.com. Keep shooting. Thanks, guys. See ya.